Yes, the season is definitely upon us, is it not? Grisly ghouls from every tomb are closing in to seal your doom. Yes, tonight's presentation is Trio of Alien Horrors. Think Alien, Jaws, Terminator, X-1, Twilight Zone, Outer Limits, and then some. I have edited out any profanity. I've toned down a few of the bits in the story, but it still may get a little squeamish for some folks, but only a little bit. So listener discretion is advised. You've been warned. I am the fear that keeps you awake. I'm the shadows on the wall and the monsters they become. I'm the nightmares in your skull. I'm the dagger in your back, an extra turn upon the rack. I'm the quivering of your heart, a stabbing pain, a sudden start. Yes. Horror and terror are different creatures, really, aren't they? Horror is usually, what, eyeballs and other bloody things? Terror is more undefined, more of a supernatural unease and fear. Terror you might not always be able to see, but you can definitely feel. The following stories are a nice dosing of both, I think. Our first one is called The Green Ocean. It was a warm, wet world known as Q23. The Aldebaran sun shone down hotly on its steaming seas, turning its hothouse air into mist and cloying dampness. After the asteroid had knocked out the star drive and seized up the magnetic core, the Polaris was looking for a place to set down. It chose Q23. That was a mistake. There's no land, Cameron said. Not so much as a rock to stand on. And there wasn't. Q23 was also called Manny's planet, for Robert Manny, the astrophysicist and celestial cartographer who'd originally mapped it out during a brief flyover 20 years before. Manny's charts revealed that Q23 was dotted by numerous land masses ranging from mere centimeters to thousands of square kilometers in surface area. Yeah, but Manny was wrong. There was no land on Q23, just huge floating masses of yellow-green seaweed that must have confused or misled his probes and sensory instrumentation. Things like that had happened before. The Polaris came in fast on a quick computer trajectory. The computer, of course, had only selected a suitable landing zone based on Manny's charts. I scanned the area. I found the landmass indicated by Manny's coordinates, and it set the ship down. One minute, the crew of Polaris were all groggy from 6 weeks in hyperspace. The next, they were down on Q23, where the ship sank like a brick. There were 3 of them besides the captain, 4 facing a big, brave new world. I can't believe this, said Sanderson, the engineer, that there's no land here. I mean, there's got to be something, don't you think? This place is made of rock like every other planet, and somewhere there's got to be a piece of it sticking up out of this soup. Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you? Spivey said. Captain Warwick, though, was silent. He'd been silent since they clambered up from the stagnant depths, everyone crying out, splashing around in circles until they found the life raft bobbing gently in the waves. He wasn't a man given to strong emotions. He calmly accepted things as they came. What do you think, Skipper? Spivey said. Do you think there's land here? Warwick sucked in air through his teeth. Well, there's plenty of it underwater, but above it, I don't know. If it's here, we'll find it sooner or later. Yeah, sure. Sooner or later, Cameron said. I like that. In the meantime, we drift around while our food and water runs out dozens of light years from home, eh? Maybe they'll come for us, Spivey said, always brimming with youthful hope and enthusiasm. When you hadn't yet seen 21, you couldn't just accept death. Yeah, sure they will, kid, sure they will. But they all knew better than that. There was a war on, and a Class C freighter with a belly of iridium and silver ore wasn't a primary concern to the agency. Not when you had crippled warships screaming out distress calls from every quadrant. Merchant vessels just were not a high priority. Still, they went through the motions. The raft was equipped with survival gear, food, water for 16 days. It also had a high-frequency subspace light transmitter. We're sending distress pulses every 15 minutes, of course. But even if they were received, the chances of rescue were slim. It'll take a week for the SOS to get through, Cameron said dismally. And even if it does, they mount a rescue the same day they get it. They won't make it out this far for 6 weeks. 6 freaking weeks, gentlemen. And by then we'll all be... That'll do, Warwick said. I think we're all aware of the straits we're in here, Cameron. Yeah, knock it off, Sanderson said. He was clenching his hands in a fist just to keep from shaking. He didn't like garbage like this. The natural world was too full of unknowns, imponderables, crazy random events, you know. You couldn't count on anything, expect nothing but the unexpected. Yeah, and so this is why he liked machines. They always did what they were told to do. They acted within a controllable framework, and when they didn't, they could be fixed. Yeah, but out here in nature, in this forsaken stinkhole, things just happened, and they were beyond control. By the time you saw what was wrong, you were usually dead or darn close to it. He would have killed for some good whiskey. Or bad whiskey, for that matter. Well, there's plenty of water anyway, Spivey said, sheepishly, never knowing if he was saying the right thing or not. You never could tell with Cameron. He lived to insult people, and this time was no exception. Water! Ha! You call this water, you dumb pup? He reached out and scooped up a handful of it. It was pale green in color, full of sediment and runny slime. Maybe it can be purified, yeah? Spivey said. Maybe. Cameron laughed again. Stinking soup is what it is, kid. That's what it is. No one argued with that. No doubt the ocean of Q-23 was water-based. They didn't know it. Not yet. It hadn't been tested with the Enviro kit. But it was like no water they'd seen before. Thick, swampy, more liquid than solid, but not much more. A foul steam rose off of it, filling the damp air with an awful decayed stink. It created hazy, cloistral yellow mist that engulfed everything. Visibility was down to less than 10 yards at best. The raft drifted slowly, very slowly. The sluggish plasma-like content of the sea was brushed by very few currents and no wind whatsoever. Waves were minimal here, nearly non-existent. The surface was veined with rotting creepers and scraggly floating plants, clots of red algae, jelly clumps of seaweed. It almost looked like you could walk across it. Well, our choices are few here, gentlemen. We're stuck here. We're going to have to make the best of it. We'll keep sending out our distress calls, but we're to proceed as if they have not been heard. We have to find some dry land or die trying. Sanderson, get out the scope, start scanning. Cameron, get out the kit, test the water. Spivey, you and me will start unpacking some of this gear. Finally, everyone had something to do. Sanderson went about happily setting up the scope and checking relays. Cameron got out the Enviro kit, sucked up some water. Warwick and Spivey unpacked tarps, sleeping bags, food, water, medical supplies, survival gear. It was good for everyone to have a purpose, but, well, better than brooding about death anyway. Even old Cameron was not grumbling too much about it. An hour later, everyone was reclined on their sleeping bags. It was far too hot to actually slip into the bags, which were good to 60 below. The heat here was suffocating. It seemed like the air was made of the same stuff as the water. It was so moist it made your lips wet just breathing. Sanderson was not resting. His eyes were fixed on the blue screen of the scope. By making numerous adjustments and readings, he was able to distinguish between water and floating islands of weeds. He even discovered a shelf of rock only 3 feet below the surface. But that dropped away into the abyss quickly enough. He was in his element, though, with electronic devices. Skipper! I've got something! Land? Everyone was breathless now. Yes, yeah, I think so. It's not big. It's about, 150 meters long, 30 in diameter. Everyone was watching the screen. They could see it. A long lozenge-shaped streak of dark blue. And as they watched, it suddenly disappeared. What was that? Sanderson said. It was gone. Just gone. Must be the machine. There's nothing wrong with my machine, Sanderson contended, checking meters and connections. It's working all right. It can't be working. Land does not appear and then disappear. Cameron laughed with a high, unpleasant tittering sound. Must have been a mirage. Probably was never there to begin with, right? That thing's a piece of junk. Just the stupid toys. Sanderson clenched his teeth. No way. The scope is fine, I'm telling you. I recalibrated it myself. Warwick raised a bushy eyebrow. Explanation, then? All eyes were on him now. Sanderson licked his lips, choosing his words carefully. I don't know. I don't know, Cap. Some sort of strange atmospheric anomaly, maybe. Either that or the landmass just suddenly sank. Take your pick. Maybe it was a whale. Maybe it dove beneath the surface, eh? Although it was meant as a stupid joke, the possibility of what Cameron was saying hit them all. Maybe it was a living thing, a huge living thing out there somewhere, rising, diving at will. It was not a comforting thought when you're in a life raft. That's big, Spivey said. Something that big? We're going to need a bigger raft. Is that even possible? Warwick asked. Sanderson wiped rivers of sweat from his face. He gobbled a few salt tablets to regulate his water. Yeah, sure. This thing isn't made to differentiate between organic and non-organic like the one on the ship. Spivey looked suddenly very pale, very old. He crawled away and laid on his bag, closing his eyes very tightly. Yeah, he was young and he did not want to hear any more. Maybe it's a shark, Cameron said. Some big hungry shark swimming through the murk. Warwick narrowed his eyes. That'll do, mister. Suddenly the blip appeared again, and then disappeared. It kept doing so at random intervals, but each time it was closer. No one was speaking now. The idea there was a landmass had been forgotten. Land masses did not dive in and out of the water. Sanderson's fingers were trembling at the controls of the scope. Spivey was still laid out in his bag, curled up and down in a fetal position. His lips were moving silently. The others watched the screen. Illuminated by the soft blue glow of the scope, their faces were sweaty, strained. The world was silent, as if it was holding its breath. 1 kilometer and closing, Sanderson said. It's bearing down on us, Skipper. It's coming right at us. We gotta get out of here. We gotta get out of here, Spivey said in an awful screeching voice. It was a voice of mental strain, prolonged hardship, a voice that should not belong to a 20-year-old. The mind that directed it was cracking around the edges, coming apart. We gotta get out of here. All right, Spivey, Warwick said, trying to sound fatherly, comforting, although he himself had no children and never even had held a baby. Take it easy. Take it easy, son. There's nothing to get excited about here. Sarcastic chuckle from Cameron. 500 meters, Sanderson droned, more machine than human now. Well, Skipper, what are we going to do? Are we just going to sit here and while that thing gets closer and closer? Are we going to do something? I don't know about you. I sure didn't join the service to be a hot lunch. Warwick said nothing. He was still vainly clinging to the idea that this was no beast, no alien predator stalking them, but deep down, he knew better. He'd been with the agency for 20 years. And if that experience had impressed nothing else upon him, was the fact that life existed just about anywhere, under any circumstances. Life will find a way. And life survived by consuming other life. Well, Cameron screamed, you're the captain here, Warwick. Give us a command. Do something, for crying out loud. It's getting closer. We have to get out of here, Captain. Shut up, you fool, or I swear I'll feed you to that thing personally, Warwick said, showing about as much emotion as anyone had ever seen from him. He walked over to the survival gear. He took out a large flare gun, a blue pistol with a short blunt barrel and a pulsar. You gonna blast it, Captain? You gonna blast it? Yeah? Spivey asked. 200 meters, Sanderson mumbled. All right. Let's get this thing out of here. The raft canopy was unzipped, oars passed out. There was a small electric outboard, but there was no use. The props would get clogged in this muck before they even got a dozen yards. This was thicker than pea soup. At least if it was pea soup, they'd have their fortunes made, wouldn't they? But no. Cameron and Spivey sunk their oars into the water and started paddling. It went much easier than anyone imagined. Though the water was semi-fluidic slush clogged with rotting organic matter, its very composition gave the oars very easy purchase. Rather than rowing through the mire, they were actually pushing the raft through it, rubberized bottom sliding easily over the colloidal surface. 75 meters, Sanderson said. It's changing course. It's compensating. It's turning as we move, guys. It's seeking us out. Ah, crap, Cameron said, rowing madly now, his breath coming in ragged gas, sweat rolling down his face. Warwick put a cartridge in the pulser and got ready. He took up the flare gun with his other hand. The planet was not exactly dark, nor exactly light. The heavy, congealing mist made it murky, Stygian almost. Very little sunlight penetrated the cloudy atmosphere, and what did was filtered by mist. 30 meters, Sanderson said. Should be visual soon. Should be able to... And then they all heard it. Slop, slop, slop. An awful sloshing, squishing sound like an elephant stumbling through a swamp. Warwick clenched his teeth and fired a flare in the direction of the noise. There was a blinding yellow-white explosion of phosphorus, and the mist flared with flickering, eerie light. They heard the splashing sounds and glimpsed something shiny and wet like gray neoprene slithering down into the water. Oh, bugger, Sanderson said. They rowed with renewed frenzy, but it was no good. The oozing waters were alive now as some huge, nightmarish body moved around and beneath them, sending fingers of undulating currents in every direction. Come on, you monster, Warwick growled. Show yourself. Sanderson was crouched before the scope, his jaw sprung, a trickle of drool on his chin. Cameron was rowing, and they're beginning to spin in circles now as Spivey had simply given up. He was rolled up in a ball, whimpering. Coward! Cameron wailed. Worthless, stinking coward! You're gonna get us all killed! At that particular moment, there was a movement beneath the raft. A horrible, sluicing eruption of primal force, and the raft was lifted from the slime and dropped back down again. Someone screamed. Someone else yelled. A voice begged for mercy. There was a colossal explosion of viscid water, and the beast showed itself. It came up from the marshy depths like a rocket, a surge of gray, quivering flesh in the shape of a gigantic worm. It exuded a cloudburst of pink slime that rained down in globs, and as quickly as it shown itself, it dove back down, leaving a stink of carrion and decaying mud behind. The raft heaved, rolled in its wake. Everyone was tossed asunder. Warwick never even got off a shot. He steadied himself as it came. He tried to get a clear shot as bodies scrambled about him and voices screamed, cried, and shouted. It shot out of the muck again, and this time everyone got a good look at the business end of the thing. Its snout was eyeless and conical, a mouth opening wider and wider like a train tunnel. Warwick shouted something unintelligible and squeezed off a shot with the pulser. A burning column of red slit through a segment of the beast with a hissing squeal, vaporizing flesh and black blood and an acrid smoke. Got to get out of here, Spivey bawled mindlessly. I've got to get out of here, out of here. Before anyone could stop him, he threw himself overboard and into the black, seething ocean. For one crazy moment, he looked utterly ridiculous as he floated on the muck on his back, his legs and arms bicycling madly. Then he broke through the film and went down. He came back up, gagging his face black with sludge. Warwick reached out to him. Give me your hand, Spivey. Come on, give me your hand. But there was no time. The worm came again and grabbed Spivey, diving into the abyss. There was another massive splash, and the remaining crewmen were inundated with rotting muck and weeds. There was silence. Maybe 5, 10 seconds. The amount of time it takes the human mind to reorient itself to a fresh slate of horrors. About 20 yards distant, Spivey came back, bobbing up and down as if something was tugging at him from below, his face dead and yellow. He bobbed up a final time and tipped over. There was nothing beneath his waist but red confetti. The beast came up again from beneath the raft. Everything and everyone in it was sent airborne and then into the rippling miasma. The remaining crewmen came up, clawing weeds and silt from their faces. The worm circled them with great fluidic speed, creating a whirlpool that spun them around and around, and then it went for the raft, engulfing it and disappearing. The whirlpool dissipated, and the 3 survivors left treading water. Maybe you just wanted the raft, Sanderson panted. Warwick shook water from his face. Could be. When I shot it, maybe it thought the raft had attacked it. Cameron laughed with a short, sharp bark. Yeah, we messed with it, so it was messing with us. Imagine that, will you? I guess there's only one question left now. Sanderson and Warwick looked at him. How long do you think we can tread water? Yeah, but they never put that question to the acid test, because the sea around them began to move, thrash with rippling currents. Conflicting waves lifted them up and dropped them into the troughs between. Ah, hell, Warwick said as the whirlpool rose up again, whirling them around, making them bob up and down, and then the yawning gargantuan mouth of the worm opened beneath them like a black, fathomless gulf, sucking them into darkness. After a time, the sea settled down, and later, much later, a single boot, floated to the surface. Yeah, but nothing else. Ooh. So that's the green ocean. And I'm not sure I was real explicit at the beginning. We got 3 stories tonight. That was the first of 3. So now we have 2 more. But let's say we get out of this mucky, murky miasma. I think my toes are getting wrinkled. So the next one is called The City of Frozen Shadows. The city was silent, blown by frigid winds. Its streets and thoroughfares were barren as the night came on. Trees were denuded and gnarled. No grass grew here. No cats prowled. No night birds flew. Machinery was abandoned, and houses were weathered gray, silent as bones. The stars looked down cold and pitiless, and only ghosts walked its streets. It was a graveyard. Alone. Charles Taylor was alone. Alone in the dead urban moonscape, a pitted and gouged netherworld of shadowy buildings that were hulking, crumbling monoliths from a decayed and deceased civilization. Those that had built them were mummies now, drained of warmth and life, discarded like empty cans. All of them had been put to bed, tucked into sarcophagi and kissed by dust. Charles Taylor was alone. Charles Taylor had red blood in his veins. He was alive. He was the last of the free men. Or at least, this is what he told himself. It was easier that way. The darkness was heavy and waiting. The wind cold. It was always cold here. The world was wrapped in heavy cloud cover now. Light could penetrate it, but not heat. Nuclear winter. It had been this way for a year now since the Stygians came. Since they had made Earth, like their own world, frozen and stark. Charles Taylor pressed himself into the shadows of the building, a 9mm automatic in his fist, a .38 in his coat pocket. He carried a knife, too. He was not afraid to use them. They'd been quiet for days now. He did not like that. The hunters were out there somewhere. The hunters. They looked like men and women and children, but they were not human. Mannequins animated by their alien puppet masters. Nothing more. And he thought, the last one? Am I really the last one? The last breath of life in this sterile world? He looked up and down the street. The city was suffused with surreal glow, brooding an ancient moon above. He dashed from his hiding place and sought the shadows of a near row of abandoned cars. He crept along them like a cat. In the distance, he heard the peculiar sharp whirring of the alien war machines. They patrolled the streets, and the fact that they still did said something. If he were the last man, why would the death machines keep up this vigil? Charles Taylor licked his lips, his breath frosted into the night. Sometimes he thought it was all a game with them. They had superior technology. No doubt they had methods of scanning. Technology is probably light years beyond infrared. So why didn't they just pick up his heat signature and do away with him then? He should have been easy to spot in the ice sculpture of the city. He lit a cigarette, daring them to find him. His disobedience was a raw and hurting sore to them, or at least he hoped so. It was at times like this, when the loneliness lay on him like concrete, that he found himself thinking about Barbara. Barbara. They were married 2 months when it all started raining down from the stars. Barbara. and in love. Oh, how they'd been. Enough. Enough, he told himself. He couldn't think like that. Barbara was dead. She was a part of the past. Taylor grimaced with hate. The hatred cleared his head. His face had long ago gone to leather from the bitter temperatures. His beard was thick and full. With the black watch cap pulled down over his ears, he looked like a burglar. That was fine because he was one. It was how he made his living before they came, and even now, crouched alongside a minivan, his pack was filled with cans of food he'd stolen. Stolen? Nah, it was hardly... Quiet. Quiet. Yes. Yes, they were coming. A group of hunters. He sucked in a breath. His teeth wanted to chatter. His belly was filled with crawling things. He heard their footsteps. They did not speak. They marched with military efficiency, searching out stragglers. He saw them spill onto the avenue, 5 shapes cut from black cloth, machines, drones. They moved as one, remorseless, merciless, unrelenting. They walked past the rows of vehicles and stopped. Taylor did not breathe. Neither did Gyro. His heart did not beat. His cells did not divide. He went to stone and waited. He'd gotten so good at waiting his silence, only Marble Bust was better at it. The hunters stood there, still as graveyard statues, all staring up the street, and then they suddenly turned their heads in his direction, but all at the same time like they were hooked into a central brain, which, yeah, they were. Dead, yes. They were all dead as such, chips in their brains now. Their physiologies forever altered by alien biomedical technology. Taylor knew he had to make a break for it. He slowly backed into the oily pool of shadows cast by his savings and loan building. Oh, the old Bailey savings and loan. And they saw him right away. He knew by long experience that they did not hunt by sight or sound or even body heat, but by motion. And even the motion of lungs or the action of a heart muscle was enough. They could pinpoint you. They knew you were near. One of them, a woman, spotted him. Her eyes were huge and glistening like red pools of blood. No pupils, just black red orbs swimming in unblinking sockets. She jabbed a finger at him and made a dry, hissing sound. The others began to hiss now, too, like human insects, like locusts. Taylor stood his ground, drawing them in like a fly into a web. They fanned out, hissing like tea kettles, staring and pointing and hungry for the warmth that was in him. He let them get in closer. Closer. Their faces were pallid, etched by frost, painted yellow by the glacial moon. He kept the 9mm against his leg, made no threatening moves. They came on like marauding ants, anxious to strip the carcass of an injured mouse. Closer. Just a little closer. He smiled. Not this time, losers, he said under his breath. When they were maybe 10 feet away and he was certain he could not miss, he opened up. The automatic jerked in his gloved fist, gouts of flame spitting from the barrel. A man took 2 slugs that spun him around into another. A woman, her partner, another. The Taylor kept firing until they were all down and dripping that cold green sap they called blood. They were all silent then, except one woman. Half her face was slack. Her lips pulled away from even, perfect white teeth, eyes glowing with a malefic, cheated hatred. She began to hiss as gouts of green fluid spilled from her mouth. Her wounds steamed in the air. Taylor shot her between glowing eyes. The night grew heavy and black. He wasn't worried about the hunters he'd drilled. He'd greased them in a neighborhood far from his own. He'd only been there scavenging. Let them bring in their machines. Let them level it. He was far away, laughing, because maybe he was simply tired of crying, and killing them was the only true pleasure he had left. And this month he clipped 17 so far. He kept telling himself that there had to be others, brothers and sisters with warmth in their veins and fight in their hearts, comrades in the resistance. If he had survived, so had others. At least so he told himself. His life was a tight, ceaseless circle of grim repetition. Only through habit, through disciplined routine had he survived this long. Nothing was left to chance. Impulse was unthinkable. All had to be plotted out. When to leave his hideout, when to gather food, when to sleep, when to eat, when to search for others. Shortly after he'd gone into hiding, he'd raided a National Guard armory. He had guns, handguns, grenades, automatic rifles, submachine guns, even perimeter mines. Things he'd used when he was a soldier years before. For a time, he'd booby-trapped old houses and buildings, leaving little surprises for the hunters. He only stopped when it occurred to him when he thought he might accidentally kill living men or women. He was sitting in a bombed-out ruin of a tenement now. waiting, smoking, watching the streets below through a missing section of wall, watching the moon lord over the city. In the distance, he could hear the war machines, but not too often. Not like a few months ago. Time to move. He made sure his guns were loaded and ready, that his knife slid easily from its oiled sheath. Check. He stood up. There was a figure leaning up against a pile of rubble, just sitting there, maybe trying to blend in. A hunter? I didn't think so, but he had to be sure. He slid his knife from its sheath. It was K-bar, a fighting knife favored by the U.S. Marines once upon a time. It had a black rubberized handle, a blue steel blade, 7 inches long, sharp enough to slit a hair lengthwise. He moved quickly, quietly, like a cat. The figure sat in a somewhat precarious position, back against the rubble, feet dangling into the night where the wall had once been, and nothing below but a 3-story drop. Taylor was careful. He knew the Stygians liked to set out traps, baiting them with flesh and blood humans. More than once he'd been sucked into such a scenario as that. Once they'd used a child, unthinkable, but was how they were, cold, alien intellects, and treated humans like insects to be used or crushed. He came up on his quarry after he was certain there were no hunters hiding in the shadows. The figure was a man. He saw that much. He came up quick, put his knife against his throat, but it was too late. The guy was already gone. Maybe tonight, maybe last night, he'd slit his wrists. Damn. Why couldn't you have waited for me? Taylor said to him. One more night. A few hours. Would it have been that long? But Taylor knew the lonely desperation of solitude, of being the sole survivor. He envied him, envied his peace, his escape, his strength. He forced his hands away from the man's throat. The body tipped and fell into the night before he could stop it. It hit the walk below and shattered like glass. And that, he knew, was more than mere cold. You didn't freeze up like that from the wind. The Stygians had been at that man. They had touched him. Whenever they touched someone, they went to ice. Crystals had been dipped in liquid oxygen. He remembered finding Barbara like that and how she broke apart as he touched her. Just crystals. Gone. Taylor slumped over and wept. The world was dead, and death had come from the stars. But it hadn't come with flying saucers or comic book destruction. It had come quietly. The old SETI network had picked up the first signal. They called it hyperlight transmission. It nearly overloaded their computers and took weeks to sort out the mathematical language. Finally, all the money spent searching the heavens for neighbors had paid off. The communication was from a planet called Stygia. It was the 7th planet circling a star designated TXK 221b by the aliens, but known to Earth astronomers as Theta Eridani, a binary star in the constellation of Eridanus, some 160 light years from Earth. They were uncertain as to our location. They wished to know more of our world and its people, they said. They gave the SETI astronomers a precise bandwidth and were told they would amplify our signal in order to speed up the time lag, which otherwise would have taken hundreds of years. The astronomers transmitted the required info. And the Stygians were never heard from again. The astronomers promised it would take time, but years and years passed with no further contact. It was puzzling, disturbing to some militarists who were against the SETI project from the beginning, considering it foolish to be broadcasting our position to anyone who might be listening out in the cosmos, an invitation to invasion. And the idea was not simply paranoid, but backed by science. Think of it. If evolution occurred on alien worlds the way it had on Earth, there could be great danger. For natural selection had generally channeled intellect to predators. Hunting and stalking required tactics, patterns, basic problem solving, the progenitors of true intelligence. 5 years passed since the original Stygian communication. It became the butt of jokes, the focus of paranoia and conspiracy. Then an unthinkable chain of dire events began. A virus invaded Earth's computer systems, and nearly overnight, anything with a memory chip in it shut down. Machinery would no longer function. The climate began to grow colder by the day, and lastly, an infectious plague swept the planet. Within a month, what remained of the human race, barely a third of what had been 6 weeks before, were swept into the Stone Age like hairballs into a dustbin. Civilization teetered, and then collapsed entirely. The Stygians arrived a year later in force. By the time they got there, the world was already beaten by them. And this, with no fancy light shows or Hollywood pyrotechnics, was only a matter of rounding up the stragglers. The predators, as it were, had arrived. Yes, those predators. The hunters. They were on his trail now. Taylor was running, Vaulting snowdrifts skirting patches of black ice. The city reared up cold and dark and silent around him. He saw the subway entrance ahead opening for him like the maw of some primal beast. He slipped down there, waited on the steps with his heart thick in his throat, his lungs full of fire. He had the 9mm out, and he wished he'd brought a submachine gun with him. He listened. They were coming. About 20 or 30 of them flowed into the icy streets, bleeding from the shadows. They carried no weapons. They didn't need to. They had formed up in ranks, marching in two single-file columns like automatons. The moonlight was reflected in the mirrored pools of their eyes. Taylor went down the steps, urging his footfalls to be silent as drifting feathers. Down, down, down. He paused in the freezing darkness. It pooled around him, black as tar. He had a flashlight with him, but he didn't dare turn it on. He stood on the platform. Darkness was a palpable thing now. Grainy, living, breathing. He moved quietly through it. He followed the tiled wall until he found the drop to the tracks. He hopped down there and stalked through the tunnel. He guided himself using the wall, superstitious terror seizing him. He was alone in the dark with whatever waited. Yeah, but that was crazy, wasn't it? Because there was nothing in the dark, not anymore. Nothing haunted the dark but ghosts and memories, and the pale, lonely things they were. He kept pausing, listening, hearing nothing but his labored breathing, the blood rushing in his ears. Maybe, just maybe, he'd gotten lucky. Perhaps they hadn't followed him. He didn't use the subways much because they disturbed him, cave-like, claustrophobic, sunless, like being shut up in a closet or a coffin. Sucking in a deep, sharp, nervous breath. He dug out his Techno flashlight and clicked it on. The brilliance of the beam was positively blinding. He saw the tracks winding off into the murk. A smoky haze hung in the air. Motes of dust danced in the beam like drifting moths. He saw a few skeletons heaped in a corner. A jawless skull farther up the track. Things like that had long since ceased to bother him. And then, footsteps. Damn. He clicked off the light, a pain ripping through his chest. He could hear their footfalls clearly now, echoing through the underworld. Yeah, he'd fooled them for a bit, but now they knew where he'd gone. He heard their footsteps coming down the stairs. Light, careful, patient. Then on the platform he could hear them hissing and whispering. Tunnels caught the sound, amplified it. He slipped away, boots placed softly, expertly. He moved on, keeping in contact with the stone wall. Sooner or later he knew he'd find what he was looking for. Thud, thud, thud. They're in the tunnels now, too. Taylor started moving faster. They could sense motion. They could see in the darkness like hunting cats. They could hear him coming now, stealthily. Their hissings were echoing eerily through the passage. They filled his head with nightmare imagery. Anemic faces, huge red eyes, killing fingers, cruel mouths. Close and closer. He stopped dead. Up ahead of him, another sound. A slow, lumbering sound, a dragging noise moving in his direction. More of them? He heard it, and then it was gone. His brain, inspired by too many Saturday afternoons B-movies, envisioned a giant spider living in the fathomless dark, the tunnels strewn with webs festooned with dangling human remains. Or maybe it was just an ugly clown. Whatever, there was no time for imagination here. The hunters were very close now. If he squinted his eyes, he could nearly make out their shambling, shadowy forms. He found a recess in the concrete wall, and a door set into it. He allowed himself to breathe, a maintenance port. The door came open, squeaking loudly. He slipped through it, shut it quickly behind him. There was a catch on the inside. He threw it. As he started up the ladder to the world above, he heard them at the door, fists hammering, nails scratching over rusting metal, the hissings and shrilling and angry whispers. He only wished there was time to booby-trap the ladder. He moved up it quickly. It shook and groaned, and he was certain it would pull from its cement housing, but it held. He saw light above, a street grating above his head. Shadows latticed his face. He peered through the slats and saw the city, the moon brooding over it, full and lonesome. Below, they still worked at the door in the subway. They were nothing if not diligent. He swallowed a mouthful of raw fear and pushed at the grating. For a moment or two, it wouldn't budge. He kept at it, though, until the ice that welded it in place came free. It clattered onto the sidewalk, and he lunged out, rolling through the snow. Right away, he heard the shrill sound of war machines. They were coming. One of them prowled from the black mouth of an alley. It looked very much like an elliptical spheroid made of shiny blue-black metal. It was crystalline like a diamond. A series of jointed mechanical legs, 3 on each side, supported it. The first time Taylor saw one, he thought Earth had been invaded by giant spiders, because that's what they resembled. He crab-crawled into the shadows. The war machine knew there was a human nearby, something alive. It moved in his direction, the tips of its legs ringing out with a subtle, hollow clanging as it approached. Taylor, poised on the edge of a scream, ran into the confines of a crumbling building. A red light from the machine bathed the rubble, casting leery, dancing shadows in the night. He held his breath. Something suddenly growled in the blackness and ran over his legs and into the street. A cat. A living cat. Taylor could scarcely believe it. He hadn't seen a cat since... Taylor slipped through the wreckage and out of a cavernous hole in the wall. He was in an alley here. He traveled down its length. It was L-shaped and veered off to the left. He darted down there and hid behind an overturned dumpster. The alley suddenly lit up with an eerie, ethereal glow. It was ghostly, flickering. He waited. He'd never seen anything like this before. What did it mean? His heart threatened to pound from his chest, and cold sweat trickled down his spine. He heard that noise again, the one he'd heard in the subway tunnel, that heavy, cumbersome, dragging sound. It was a dry, crackling noise like leaves crunching and static electricity arcing from blankets. It got closer and louder. His skin was crawling. A tingling hole had opened up inside of him. Because he knew. He suddenly knew. Charles Taylor had never seen a Stygian. He didn't think anyone ever had. Well, no one that lived to tell the tale. He peered from behind the dumpster to where the alley angled off. Again, the frost-veined brick wall, that weird shimmering light played and pulsed, and a huge and gruesome shadow was thrown, swollen to nightmare proportions by the glow. Taylor saw a creeping, slithering mass of waving appendages and snaking limbs. Too much motion, too many things moving, coiling at the same time. He heard a strange, wet, mewling sound. It was cold, and it was hot, his body thrumming with pure animal terror, because that dreadful and discordant mewling was the Stygian's voice. Taylor screamed. It was calling him by name. An hour later, he was back in his hideout, his crib. He dozed and woke alternately, covered in icy sweat. He shivered with fever. His dreams dark and menacing. Finally, true sleep came, and it locked him down. In his little basement apartment in the cellar of a ruined building, he slept amidst the trappings of survival in urban guerrilla warfare. Tangled in black and forbidding shadow, a grim frost fell over Taylor, wrapped him tight and soundless like a winding sheet. His eyes opened just before dawn. He was not alone. He knew that the moment consciousness flooded into his brain. He'd been living by an instinct, living like an animal for too long not to sense the invasion of his burrow. He came awake with the .357 Smith he kept under his pillow. He saw shadows upon shadows knotted and snarled together like jungle vines and creepers and leafage. There was an escape route behind him, a passage that led into the sewers, into freedom. He saw a form in the darkness. He heard its breathing. The eyes glistened. "You don't need the gun," it said. Put it away." Taylor went white with fear. It was his wife's voice, Barbara. She had been dead these many months, frozen like an icicle, and like an icicle shattered. And now she was back, resurrected, it would seem, via Stygian technology. He made a dash. He clicked on the battery-powered light. Their kind didn't like the light, and true to form, she shrieked and hissed, covering her ashen face with long, pale fingers. She made a hissing sound, then seemed to control herself. "Please, Charles, turn off the light. Turn it off." And he wanted to. It was blinding. You've come from me." A statement. They sent you. Between the chill shafts of her fingers, her eyes were red neon bulbs. It was time. And he knew it was. She had not come alone. He could hear others outside, a ghastly knot of them trembling beyond the doorway. He thought he heard others creeping up his escape passage. They sounded like snakes gliding over stone. They had him. They're making it easy on him by letting Barbara, or the thing that wore Barbara's face, by letting Barbara take him. It was the most he could hope for. Charles Taylor dropped the gun. So tired, so broken, so defeated. But the thought of those glacial fingers bleeding the warmth from him was unthinkable. He brought out his knife and, grinning, he slashed his own wrists open. But there was no blood, just thick, translucent green syrup. It hung from his own gashed wrists like tree sap. Hog. Even me, he said, his world spinning into fragments. Even me. Barbara offered him a mannequin smile, nothing more. Yeah, the war was over, and had been for some time. Okay, then. So, our next one, I think, is either the shortest or the longest or the medium-sized one of the three. But let's get going on it, huh? So I hope you enjoyed that one. That was, what was that called? That was the city, right? The City of Frozen Shadows. So, one more. It made me think of somewhere between, I don't know, Terminator and Matrix. This next one's called Graveyard. Korib, the fourth planet in the Beta Andromeda system. Korib, a Class M red giant set in the Big Dipper. A star that flared out into the frozen blackness of space like a huge and angry eye the color of fresh blood. We fell into an eccentric elliptical orbit around the planet. We hung there like a fly in a spider's web, our perigee so darn low we nearly brushed the clouds on that first pass. Within an hour, Breitenbach, the first officer, called us up to the bridge and let us get a good long look at that black and cryptic world spinning below us. We're afraid of, for crying out loud, I said. Why do we pull this? We're not military or expeditionary. We're merchants. We haul ore. This isn't our thing. Breitenbach gave me his usual dour look. He was a round little man with a face just as red as Wisconsin cherries, the top of his balding head pink as a party balloon. He licked his lips. There's a colony down there, Starling, he said, fixing me with his sharp blue eyes. A colony with nearly 2,000 people. Thing is, smart boy, nobody's heard from them in nearly 2 months. No subspace chatter, no telemetry, no cyberspace, not even a smoke signal, you know? I wasn't exactly moved by their plight. Well, first off, we're not trained for this stuff. You're going down anywhere, Starling. We're the nearest ship, so we get this. It would take 5 months for anybody else to get out this far. Kurtz, running a hand through her spiky red locks, dropped me a wink. Come on, Starling, where's your curiosity? Your sense of adventure? Yeah, I must have left it in my other pants. Kurtz started laughing. Yeah, Kurtz would laugh at anything. Didn't matter what you said to her, she laughed. That's what I love about you, Starling, your yellow streak. Yeah, some people says it goes with my eyes. Breitenbach sighed. Trust me, Starling, I don't like putting people down there. I don't have a choice. We already lost a drone. I need someone on the ground. It's you. Panachek, the third officer, and Cooperly, one of the systems hacks, joined us now, staring down at Cora below, not saying a thing. Panachek was pretty militaristic. His idea of civic action was a good carpet bombing. Cooperly was quiet, real quiet. Breitenbach looked us over. Yeah, well, you can't take one of the shuttles down. Everything's already been programmed into it. You can just take the shuttle. You'll touch down just outside New Bayonne, okay? You'll wear environmental suits just to be on the safe side. The power's out down there and the sun won't rise for another 2 weeks. Just look around, right? You can't find anyone, just grab any records, any hollow spheres you can find. Track down the drone if you can. You'll be on the ground a couple hours, tops. He kept talking. I wasn't listening. I was staring at Korib down there, thinking. Thinking. It was ominous. Lifeless world from what I could see, shrouded in heavy cloud cover like a mask it was waiting to remove at midnight. The thing was, midnight lasted for 3 weeks on Korib on account of its lunatic orbit. The flesh at the base of my spine, was literally crawling. The planet reminded me of some gigantic mausoleum, an alien spook house of creeping shapes and nightmare shadows. We were going into it like a bunch of scared kids entering a deserted house in a dead forest. Any more questions? There weren't any. Right then. You just take your time. It's going to be real dark down there. We broke through the lower atmosphere like a pebble dropped into a murky, stagnant pond and sank without a trace. Kurtz tried to lighten things up by insulting me, but she didn't get any laughs. Our humor had dried up like the spit in our mouths. We touched down on the landing pad on the perimeter of New Bayonne. The only lights were the ones from the shuttle. It was black as the inside of a body bag out there, the air full of wild flying shapes like witches haunting the sky. Kurtz was quick to point out that what we were seeing were just patches of mist. Yeah, I had trouble believing that. Panachek called the ship, told them we were landing in one piece. We pulled our helmets on over our strained, bloodless faces, and Panachek broke the airlock, and we stepped out in the forever night of Korab. There was a good wind blowing. You could feel it hit you the moment you got off the ship. It was a raging, frenzied dust storm out there, the air full of tiny fragments that peppered the outsides of our suits. Kurtz had the scanner, being the only one proficient in its use. It looked like a black rectangle on her left forearm, its surface crowded with readouts and graphs. She had it set to continually scan for life forms, give her constant info on atmospheric conditions and the like. She walked in a semicircle, her left arm held out. Yeah, well, there's nothing alive out there I'm picking up. No feed from the drone. But this storm, whatever the heck it is, I don't know. My signals could be bouncing right back at me. The city's directly ahead, gentlemen. Through my ear mic, I heard Panachek say, "Something doesn't wash here, people. The brainplex gave me a profile of Cora before we came down. The air is clear here. Windy, sure, but it's not full of grit like this. If we tried to breathe this stuff, it'd be like sucking desert through sand through a pipe. I finished for him. Yeah, like that." Cooperly was breathing hard. You could hear him. "Maybe we should just get out of here." Kurtz ignored him. Yeah. Something's wrong here. Scanner's telling me air is breathable, but it's not telling me squat about all this dust or whatever it is. Our helmet lights were full of it. Motes of something flying and drifting all around us like snowflakes. Our bright orange suits were gray with this stuff, and the closer we got to the city, the thicker it became, like wading through a vacuum bag filled with wind-driven cigarette ash. It wasn't only in the air, but layered on the ground, too. The four of us plodded on through darkness, staying in a tight formation. 4 scared people in bright orange composite E-suits with those squarish helmets with the banks of lights running down either side. And suddenly we could see the city rising up out of the murk, a huge, desolate graveyard beckoning to us. We saw nothing move out of there, just a lot of prefab buildings, Quonset huts dipped in shadow, deserted and somehow deadly. A few narrow, winding streets. Just inside the city, we paused, speechless. In the glow of our interior helmet lights, we could see our faces, sallow and tight, eyes sunken into black hollows. We all knew something was terribly wrong. We just didn't know what. There was a sudden crackling of static. Large, sharp, intrusive. I nearly fell out of my skin. That was Breitenbach up on the ship checking in. "Just want to remind you, kids, not to talk to strangers down there." A few of us uttered nervous laughter. The sort of laughter is just the side of a scream. It was bad down there. Bleak, haunted, suffocating. Had all the atmosphere of a dank, wormy casket. "Yeah, you gotta love our first officer. He's some kind of funny guy." "Yeah," Cooperly said, "funny." Panachek stooped down, picked up a glove full of that powdery material. "What is this garbage, Kurtz? That box of yours must have some idea." Kurtz just shrugged, though you couldn't really tell it in that bulky suit. It's ash," she says. "Yeah, I know it's ash. What kind of ash?" But she didn't have any answers, and on we went, staying close enough to touch one another. The city seemed like it was waiting for us now. Yeah, I know how crazy that sounds, but you could almost feel it. A waiting, endlessly patient sense of expectancy, like it had secrets, surprises in store for us and was holding its breath. Our helmet lights swept the buildings, creating ghastly panoramas of jumping shadows and casting distorted images of ourselves against the steel and stone facades. Motes of ash were caught in the beams like deep-sea silt. It was eerie, unreal, a ghost town 200 light years from Earth. "I mean, where the heck is everybody anyway?" Panachek said. "I mean, dang, show me some bodies here or something, eh?" I understood what he meant. Even a high body count would be better than this. The ash was about 6 inches deep, like freshly fallen snow. As we walked, we kicked up clouds of the stuff that twisted in the breeze. The grit in it crunched underfoot like dry autumn leaves. If you could imagine trudging through a crematorium ash pit, you get the idea. We were starting to see a lot of little heaps of ash that were gradually eroding in the wind. All that ash, and no people. I think we're all starting to make the same unpleasant. Panic stopped us. Listen, I don't know about you guys, but I want to wind this picnic up. Come on, let's split into teams, work each side of the street, right? Check out the buildings. We'll get Breitenbach his precious spheres, and then we'll get the heck out of here. Screw that drone. If we keep moving forward, we'll find the administration building right at the end of the, up there. Cooper, are you with me? Kurtz, you go with Starling. How come I always get her? I said. We parted and moved up the walks on opposite sides of the road. Kurtz and I found a few locked doors, lots of ash. Not a lot else. Finally, we found a place that appeared to be some kind of community center for the miners and researchers that called this cemetery home. Inside, we found a big cafeteria, some administration offices, a kitchen, some stale pizza. There were announcements pasted to a pegboard. Everything looked perfectly normal. Yeah, except that it was dead and empty and dark and too many heaps of ash. There were plates set out at tables, coats on hooks, a cigar butt, and an ashtray. It reminded me of that derelict ship on old Earth, the Mary Celeste. It was like that, as if the people had just walked out minutes before we'd arrived. The piles of ash were larger here, mostly untouched. My throat was so dry you could have wiped up a spill with it. I was in one of the back rooms, gathering up some hollow spheres and hard copy when Kurt screamed. I ran back out there as best as I could manage in my suit. I got out to the community room, and she was standing there with her pulsar out, ready to shoot down just about anything, myself included. In her helmet light, her face looked to be the color of cheese. I saw something up. And then, almost too calmly, up there, on the stairs. I panned it with my lights. Just a set of steps leading into the upper story, a landing above. I saw nothing there, just a grainy darkness, a blizzard of drifting ash. I was expecting Panicek across the way to pipe in, wondering what was going on, but he and Cooperty were out of range for helmet-to-helmet communication. They could only pick us up on the remote channel. I took a deep, sucking breath. There's nothing there now. What was it? She studied my face, looking for some sign that I thought she was being hysterical. She found none. It's just, I don't know. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A little emotion, you know. I turned and I saw, I don't know, something. A vague hunched over shape. Her eyes were wide. She wiped a smear of ash from her viewplate. You believe me, don't you, Starling? I told her I did. Together, me and the lead, we went up the steps, our pulsars out. I think we both badly needed to hold hands, but there just wasn't room. The stairwell was narrow. We went up step by step wordlessly. Our lights were creating a ghoulish pantomime of slinking, crawling shadows. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, and fear was rushing in my belly in thick, sickening waves. We reached the top and entered a cramped corridor studded with doors. We stood there in the silence, which was huge, menacing, listening to the beat of our hearts in our ears and the flow of blood. Nothing more. Just that immense, crushing, dead absence of sound. But for all of that, our nerve endings were humming because we knew with dread, awful certainty that we were not alone. There was something here. Something that exuded a phobic sense of occupancy. With a voice dry as cinders, Kurt said, You feel it, Starling? Yeah, I think I do. Have you ever been in a haunted house? I don't mean a carnival attraction or a VR module, but the real thing. Every town or city has one, a place of vile deeds long since past, whether real or imagined. A shunned place tenanted by silence and dust and eldritch memory. Myself, I grew up in the Martian colonies, New Baltimore to be exact, a mining town. There was an old refinery there that had been abandoned nearly a century before, and if you had the nerve, you could go in there during the dead of night, walk those empty, desolate corridors. I did it once, alone. I thought I saw a shape coming down a shaft at me, and I screamed, and I ran. I didn't stop running until I was home and safe. To this day, I'm certain there really was something there, something ancient and loathsome that had haunted Mars for centuries before we had even arrived, like the heat seekers. At that moment, I was back in that bleak, isolated ruin. We went through the rooms one by one. We found nothing of importance. On one of the beds, we found a pile of ashes in the shape of a man. See, Moon was right. But it wasn't really surprising by that point. Both Kurtz and I knew what all those ashes were. If there's anything alive, we didn't find it. Panachik opened a channel and Kurtz and I started. What's going on over there? Anything? Kurtz and I just looked at each other, decided silently not to say anything. Yeah, not a thing, she said. Starling keeps trying to back me into dark corners. I'm not sure what he's up to. How about you? There was a pause for a moment. It was pregnant with apprehension. Well, I don't know. Nothing, I guess. Cooper, he's freaking out over here. Keeps hearing sounds, seeing ghosts. Ghosts. Didn't surprise me, really. I swallowed down hard, thinking how welcome the clanking of chains or a disembodied voice and some underdone potatoes would have been about then. Anything to break up that awful soundlessness. Even a ghostly figure walking through the wall carrying its head would have been welcome. Cooper, he said, I'm not imagining anything. I tell you, we're not alone here, people. There's something out there. Something keeps watching us from the darkness. It's watching. It's watching. I could feel the goose flesh at my spine, the back of my neck. Panachik was in command. We had to do what he said. If he said we had to search through this mortuary for spheres and whatnot, then we had to. Still, I was all for making for the shuttle and getting out. Kurtz and I found a skywalk that connected the building to a mining office next door. We went over there, and again, we didn't find anything. A lot of offices, a lab, rock specimens, dead interfaces, more heaped ashes like everything else. I was starting to wonder if maybe we were all letting our imaginations gallop away on us. Despite the horror that washed through me like a sterile, lifeless green sea, I was beginning to think that very thing. I swung around suddenly because this time I was the one seeing things. For just the briefest of instants, so quickly I had to wonder if I saw anything at all. There was a face at the window overlooking the deserted streets. A grotesque, inhuman face pressed up to the pane. I let out a cry, I pulled my pulser, and I fired. A wink of cold blue light hit the window and melted into blackened embers. What? Kurtz demanded. There was no air in my lungs. I couldn't seem to speak. I swallowed, and I swallowed again. A face. Something. I'm not sure. But it was there. I saw it. What the freak's happening over there? Panachik wanted to know. Kurtz said, Starling saw something. A shape. He's playing OK Corral over here. Take it easy, man, Panachik warned. You're going to kill somebody. Kurtz was checking her scanner. I don't see any life signs out there. Bioscanners show zilch, no infrared signatures, no physiological emissions. Yeah, nothing. All right, I've had my fill, Panachik said. We're scratching this. We need backup here. We're not equipped for this. Everybody out in the street right now. We're making for the ship. Come on, let's move, people. Let's move. We didn't waste any time. Together, Kurtz and I went out the door into that raging ash storm, staying so close our suits rubbed together. That was a good thing. Company, human company. I'd never felt such a need for it before. We stood next to each other, waiting for the others. Our lights still burned bright, but there seemed to be shadows cavorting all around us. The bad thing, the really bad thing, was I didn't think we were creating those shadows. 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes we waited. An eternity when you're on a grim, vacant street with the wind throwing ash into your viewplate in some dire alien netherworld. Where the heck are they? Kurtz asked me. I could tell by her voice she was distressed, frightened, scared white maybe. I don't know. They were in a warehouse 2 buildings up the street. I knew that much. I tried to raise them on a remote channel, so did Kurtz, but we didn't get a thing. As far as communication went, they might have fallen into some black rending void. Kurtz said, Well, they're still in there. I'm picking up their life signs. We made it over to the warehouse, having to plod through some deep piles of ash that came apart like a million buzzing fragments as we disturbed them. They swallowed us in a cloud of debris like cyclones of spinning angry wasps, and somehow I lost momentary contact with Kurtz. Suddenly she wasn't touching me anymore. I spun around and was blasted in the viewplate with blinding grit. I started reaching out madly in all directions, crying out her name. But she'd only fallen. I helped her up. I hate this place, she said. Maybe she would have said more. But right then, our external mics picked up something that left us cold. First, I thought it was the others, but no, that sound. We both heard it. An odd, light pattering sound. It reminded me of the sound of bare feet running on concrete, but tiny feet, like those of children. It was about then that Cooperly punched up a remote channel and started screaming. I had a feeling he had hit the channel scan by accident. For 1 second, it was just me and Kurtz in that silent blackness, and the next, help me, please, somebody help me. Starling, Kurtz, they're everywhere, everywhere. Don't you see him? You must see him. Penachuk! Ah! Ah! And it was cut off. Kurtz and I drew our pulsers and made our way over there. We moved quickly. We were starting to get the hang of living and operating out of those stinking suits. The trick of skating through ash without going on our butts. Regardless, we made it up the walk, and at first we didn't see a thing. The warehouse door was open. We saw nothing but darkness pooling in there, graining and shifting. And then we heard sounds. Busy sounds. The sounds of motion, of many things moving at once, whispering and creeping and rustling. There's a little alleyway that ran between the warehouse, and as our lights hit it, something incredible, something shocking happened. What is that? Kurt said. It was like rolling over a rotting log and seeing thousands of ants scurrying and slinking. As our lights illuminated the scene, we saw for a brief second a quivering, industrious horde of, I don't know what, just a profusion of shapes and forms that bled away with amazing speed right up the walls of the building. Light had the same effect on them as water poured into suds, dispersal, complete dispersal. They moved off en masse and with such speed we never really got a look at what they were. About the time the shape slipped away, we caught sight of Cooperly. He was being dragged off through a doorway. We saw his booted feet kicking as he was drawn into the darkness. It didn't look as if his helmet lights were operable. Kurtz made to go after him, and I stopped her. There were just too many of those things. Maybe you couldn't see them, but you could hear them. That buzzing, whistling noise they made like swarms of locusts descending on a field. It made my skin crawl. It got inside your head. It echoed around in there until you wanted to scream. And it seemed to come from everywhere. In front of you, behind, to the left, the right, overhead, everywhere. I called the ship requesting backup, but the channel was dead. I led Kurtz around front, or maybe she led me, and we went through the entrances into the warehouse. We came into a sort of reception area full of desks and lots of ashes scattered everywhere. I could see the boot prints left by Panachek and Cooperly. Outside, we could hear the cacophony of motion again as the shapes returned. Kurtz made for a corridor, and I was right behind her. I turned, and I looked, and I saw... I'm not sure what I saw exactly. For one crazy second, I thought there was a toad standing in the doorway. Yeah, a toad, frozen into inaction by my lights. It was like that, hideous, bloated, a round-bodied thing with pebbly green, pale flesh that was set off into pulsing blue vein tracery. It had long broomstick-thin limbs that looked oddly atrophied, stubby legs, and an almost conical-shaped head with 3 eyes just as yellow and bright as full moons. What I thought was long, flowing emerald green hair was actually a mutiny of wormy fibers that squirmed and coiled. Sensory organs, maybe. And then it was gone. Yeah, I think I screamed. I knew they were out there by that point. But to see one in the flesh, as it were, horrible. It inspired an atavistic fear in me, a primal loathing, utter disgust, like seeing some large, grotesquely fattened spider stand up on 2 legs. Something inside told me to kill them all. It was one of them, I told Kurtz as she stood there looking at me. She stepped away from the corridor, consulting her scanner. It's not working. Dead. Maybe the ash. Maybe I bumped it. Oh, man, Starling, what are we going to do? Maybe we could have thrown together some plan like getting out right now, but things were happening too fast. A figure came stumbling out of the corridor, and by the size of it, I knew instantly it was Panachek. He was a big guy. Problem was, you couldn't see much of him. 7 or 8 of the things were hanging off of him like ticks on a dog's belly, swollen up like beach balls. One of Panachek's helmet lights was out. The other was damaged and dimly glowing, casting weaving, bobbing shadows as he fought and writhed and slammed himself against the walls to get them off him. Kurtz and I stood there stupidly, completely helpless, locked down tight with some instinctual revulsion of the things. We had our pulsers in our hands. We didn't dare shoot for fear of hitting Panachek, and we didn't march in and remove them because I don't think we could have touched those horrors. Panachek's viewplate was fanned out with jagged cracks. You could hear him screaming and screaming as more of them leaped onto him. There was steam rolling off him and hissing plumes. It occurred to me then they were burning through his suit. He threw himself into the door frame, and two of them burst. Panachek was splashed with whatever flowed inside of him, and pretty soon he was nothing but a smoking, sizzling mass as more of the creatures fell on him, bleaching with those appalling, sucking mouths, dissolving him. Yeah, the E-suits were real marvels of technology. Self-sealing, radiation, chemically resistant, heat-proof. They even had med nanosystem, repair anything from lacerations to broken bones. But, well, against these creatures, these suits were useless. I caught one distressing last look at Panachek's contorted face, pressed up to the viewplate, his mouth wide and screeching. I heard him let out an insane wailing sound that went right through me. Man, I can feel him. I can feel him starting. Kill me. Have pity, starling. Kill me. Kurtz and I opened up at the same time, and by then Panachek, poor guy, was a cremated, flaking mass on the ground, enveloped in those bloated little bodies. One of them turned and looked at us, its mouth wide, and I saw it was roughly oval like the maw of a lamprey, and studded with dozens and dozens of tiny hooked teeth. Then the pulsar emissions hit them, boiling them into twisted, blazing mass. Kurtz and I made to go back out into the streets. No dice there. They were coming through the doorway, an army of obese, rubbery bodies, rolling and leaping and jumping like grasshoppers. They came through the windows. They slithered over the walls, the ceiling, the floors, all making that awful whistling sound. We ran back through the corridor, blasting 5 or 6 of them out of our path. We broke through a window. We dropped into the alley. They were everywhere. The city a livid, seething carpet of them now. The rooftops, doorways, alcoves, alleyways, everywhere. Nothing but hundreds, thousands of those luminous yellow eyes clustering and then scattering as our lights played over them. But what was worse, what really tore open my mind, was that they were up in the sky, too, bounding and floating and drifting back down at us like dirigibles. They must have had some weird gas bladders in them that made them lighter than air, and I knew finally they had come from the sky. Or even then, more and more were descending like feathers on the breeze. The black sky was even blacker with their numbers, a verminous congregation spreading out like a flock of nightmarish birds. What did we do? We ran. We stumbled. We hung on to one another like things parted like the Red Sea at our approach, their numbers tightening, but patient, so incredibly patient. They were above and behind and in front. Our lights showed us things we should never have seen in that sane world. Their numbers were swelling by the minute. They fell from the sky, bouncing on the ground and darting up into the air, jumping and vaulting and hovering like they were pumped full of helium. It was like being caught in a school of deep-sea jellyfish. As they rose, they inflated themselves. They fell, deflated, like squids, was what I thought, and the air was their sea. They started getting more daring, bumping into us, striking us from above, but not attacking, not just yet. The world was a clamorous and resounding box of noise, echoing and whistling and shrilling. They seemed to be playing, if anything, like darting about and toying with us, like cats with mice. We started shooting and shooting as they encircled us like a noose. We stepped on their bodies. They gushed that juice that ate away the soles of our boots. One of them hit me and dropped me on my butt, and 2 of them vaulted at Kurtz as she cut them both in half. They exploded, washing her down with that gelatinous green filth. Her suit began to smoke and bubble, great rents opening in too many places. And then I lost sight of her as they fell onto me, blinding me by sheer numbers. I kept shooting and shooting, and pretty soon I cleared a path, and I hoped, prayed the batteries and my pulsar would hold out because the shuttle couldn't be far now. I charged through them, crying out Kurtz's name, and then I heard her screaming, and I caught sight of her. She was moving in a drunken, shambling circle, 3 or 4 of them hanging off of her. Billowing plumes of smoke and steam wound her in a raging cloud. She tripped and fell, and I saw that her suit was huge and puffy as it was filled with hot gas. But of course it wasn't filled with gas. It was the things that wormed inside of her suit, slithering and creeping inside of there with her, draining her dry as their acid kisses burned her to ash. What was the worst possible thing was that her mic was open. I heard her suffering, those sucking sounds, that pathetic screeching as she begged me to kill her. The feel of them, she cried, the horrible, greasy feel of them. Yeah. I wish I could say that I did kill her, but it just wasn't possible. There were just too many hitting me from every direction. I was running and shooting and somehow staying on my feet as those acidic secretions of theirs turned my suit into a shredding, flapping rag. And then I suddenly heard a beeping sound. I knew that I was near the ship. It was a homing signal it sent out for us. 10 or 12 of them clinging to me. I thumbed the button on my belt, and the shuttle exploded with light. Running lights, port lights, stern lights. The things made pained mewling sounds and scattered in every direction, hopping away and floating right up into the sky. I stumbled to the shuttle, bathed in that angelic light. The airlock popped open, then I was inside. I dropped into my seat and I told the Plex to take us up, back to the ship. The plasma jets fired and Cora was filled with flames and light, and up I went. I kept the exterior lights on, and I could feel those fat, pulpy little things thumping and jarring as we blasted straight through the congested storms of their bodies. They splattered against the view screen like water balloons full of limeade and burned off as the shuttle exploded from that haunted world. I saw the freighter, and right away I knew why I couldn't raise it on the radio, why I could never dock with it. My heart sank without a sound. The freighter floated there in decaying orbit, completely dark, completely forbidding, like some old world plague ship. Just looking at her, you knew she was dead. There's a great mangled cavity in her side. I don't know if it was from that meteor hit or what, but I saw a stream of corpses drifting from that rent, and I knew the ship was lifeless. I knew it was filled with those things. They rode the backs of the dead, and they clustered on the hull of the ship in a squirming mass. Apparently, they did not require an atmosphere to ply their trade. Some free-living, self-contained, hybrid migratory race of monsters. I looked down at Cora below. It was a great rotating tomb in the stark depths of space. I kept watching it, wondering what the heck I should do. Then, as if on cue, a swarm of those things began lighting from the surface. Swimming up through the clouds, they seemed to have no set destination, moved by the solar winds, maybe gravitational arcs. It was like watching thousands of flies abandon a rotten feast. They drifted up at the shuttle like forgotten parade balloons, floating on some unseen, unknowable current, looking for another world to ravage. I let the Plex pick a trajectory, and I fired the rockets. Yeah, that was all 3 weeks ago now. I'm heading to the nearest colony, which is about 10 light years out. This shuttle survival package has food and water for 6 people for 1 month. Being alone, that means 6 months. Problem is, that'll take a year to make that colony at top speed. The ship is sending out distress calls every 15 minutes on all wavelengths. Maybe I'll be rescued. Maybe not. Thing is, though, the colony should have picked up my distress call 2 weeks ago. I'm putting out a strong signal and receiving just fine, yet all I'm reading from the colony is dead air. There can be a lot of reasons for that, I suppose. But I can really only think of one. That's why I'm broadcasting this now. You see, I'm hoping there are people out there to hear this. But really, I'm beginning to doubt that.